Good evening. It is nice to see so many people here. Braving the elements, we really appreciate you being here. Welcome to Oregon State University, to CH2M Hill Alumni Center, and to the debut of the Discovery Lecture Series. I'm Todd Simmons with OSU University Relations and Marketing, and it's our distinct pleasure to see all of you here this evening for what I'm sure will be an inspiring and educational presentation. Our guest speaker, Bill McKibben, will get a proper introduction in just a moment, but I wanted to say, first of all, that it's fitting and appropriate that our initial Discovery lecture is one coming from an environmental perspective, focusing on climate change. OSU's long history in this area not only permeates our academic departments, but is reflected in the way the university is managed. Organizations ranging from the Environmental Protection Agency to the Sustainable Endowments Institute to the Sierra Club have recognized OSU's national leadership and use of green power, recycling and waste management, and construction of buildings that meet the highest environmental standards, and more. As members of the OSU and Corvallis communities will readily attest, these values are not only important to us, it's important that we model the best management practices for others and hold ourselves accountable to high standards. As I said, concern for the environment is an abiding point of interest in our academic departments and of the scientific work being conducted in Oregon State University labs. We're fortunate to be led in the latter area by an OSU graduate whose work took him from Corvallis to Washington, D.C., where he served in multiple capacities, including research director for the U.S. Navy and as head of research for NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which, as some of you may know, was the first research agency established by the U.S. government. We're very fortunate that his heart never strayed very far from Corvallis, and we're delighted to welcome him home to OSU last year. Please join me in welcoming OSU Vice President for Research, Rick Spinrad.
Thank you, Todd. On behalf of all of the Oregon State University community, welcome to the inaugural lecture for our Discovery Lecture Series, an idea that actually goes back to a conversation initiated by the head of our School for Electrical Engineering and Computer Sciences, Dr. Terry Fees, who a year ago said, why don't we focus on bringing even more prominent scientists and policymakers and writers, key policymakers and writers to Oregon State University to present on matters of national and international interest. And while we've got them here, let's show them some of what we've got and spend some quality time with these folks. So I am delighted to have as our kickoff speaker a man who has been at the forefront of issues that really are so important to many Oregonians. You'll hear more about that in a minute. This series is an important part of the OSU portfolio, a portfolio that includes more than $250 million worth of research annually, half of that in earth system sciences, including forestry and agricultural sciences. We have rankings as one of the top U.S. research universities in areas such as conservation biology, wildlife science, resource management, climate research, oceanography, fishery science, and many more. In fact, 2 scientists from Oregon State University will be among a select few to serve as lead authors in the upcoming report, the assessment report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, an organization many of you know that shared in the 2007 Nobel Prize with Vice President Gore. We also at OSU are proud to point out that we are the only institution to be honored by having 2 of our senior scientists selected by U.S. presidents, a Republican and a Democrat, to serve as administrators of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. As one of the nation's only 2 land, sea, space, and sun grant universities, we are dedicated to research, education, outreach, economic development. They are part of our DNA and are reflected in our university's strategic plan, which talks about the critical value of healthy people, healthy planets, healthy economy. I'm especially proud that we just completed the design of Oregon State's first ever research agenda, which upholds the very principles upon which the concept of land-grant institutions was developed 150 years ago. Of particular note tonight is that one of the targeted strategic research questions identified in that agenda is the challenge of understanding how our natural systems work and how we live sustainably within them. That's just one reason why I am so honored and excited to introduce our speaker, Mr. Bill McKibben. In 2007, I oversaw the Federal Observatory in Mauna Loa, where this vial was filled with air that had 382 parts per million of carbon dioxide. Today, the air above that island now has 390 parts per million carbon dioxide in it. Bill McKibben, as founder of the grassroots climate campaign 350.org, which has coordinated rallies in 189 countries since 2009, will explain why that's so critical. There's no singular label that captures who Bill McKibben is. Time magazine called him the planet's best green journalist, and the Boston Globe said in 2010 that he was, quote, probably the country's most important environmentalist. He's an academic, a Schumann Distinguished Scholar at Middlebury College. He holds honorary degrees from a dozen colleges and was elected a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is an advocate for action. Over the past 5 years alone, Bill has led a walk across Vermont demanding action on global warming that some called the largest U.S. demonstration to date on climate change. He created StepItUp07.org to demand Congress enact curbs on carbon emissions, and most recently, very recently, led several months of ultimately successful protest and lobbying against the Keystone XL tar sands pipeline. The nation's Mark Hertsgaard wrote this week, the Obama administration's decision to delay the Keystone XL pipeline is arguably the most important achievement in the climate fight in North America in years. Bill is an author extraordinaire. President of the Harvard Crimson newspaper in college, Bill is now the author of a dozen books about the environment. The End of Nature, published in 1989, is widely regarded as the first book for a general audience on climate change and has been printed in more than 20 languages. If you've read his work, you know that Bill's exquisite style includes technical insight with the spice of unique historic perspectives, from the Green Mountains of Vermont to Lucca in Tuscany. Some tasty quotes as just a bit of an example. He speaks of challenges in the world we inhabit. Quote, we do not live any longer on the flat earth that Tom Friedman postulated. Earth is an uphill planet now, where gravity exerts a stronger pull than we're used to. There's more friction than we're used to. You have to work harder to get where you're going. He speaks of opportunities through conservation. Quote, the consulting firm McKinsey estimated in 2008 that existing technologies could cut world energy demand 20% by 2020. He lists several examples and says, the list goes on a long time. We are energy wastrels, which in a sense is good news, he writes. The first round of cuts will be easy, like losing weight by cutting your hair, unquote. And he speaks of hope through microeconomics. Quote, my favorite local currency circulates in the Berkshire Mountains of western Massachusetts. Berkshires come in 5 denominations, elegantly printed with pictures of local heroes. A Mohican Indian, the artist Norman Rockwell, Herman Melville, W.E.B. Du Bois, and so on. You can get the notes at local banks. You can spend them almost anywhere. I shopped with mine at the Organic Food Co-op, but also at the Mr. Dingaling ice cream truck. You know the world could shift when you can hand over a Norman Rockwell for a fudgesicle and get a couple of Herman Melvilles back in change, unquote. A man who is willing to face prison to defend important values and principles. And more importantly, as you will now see, a man who has the courage to be interviewed earlier this week by Stephen Colbert Roll that clip.
This pipeline will gush out a resource even more precious than oil.
The Keystone project would generate 20,000 immediate jobs.
It would create at least 50,000 jobs.
In total, about 118,000 indirect jobs.
I have a suggestion for the president. Let the Keystone XL pipeline go through. He'll create 120,000 jobs.
This is the Keystone XL pipeline that some estimates said could provide up to 1 million new hydrogen jobs.
And those numbers come fresh from the pipeline those experts built from their straight to the airwaves. But, folks, Barack Obama has delayed approval of the pipeline, killing billions of jobs because he is kowtowing to environmentalist lung Nazis who protested in front of the White House last week. Where did they get off? Here to tell me where they get off. He's author, environmentalist, and one of the organizers of the Keystone XL protest, Bill McKibben. Bill, thanks so much for joining me today. Okay, Bill. The president has delayed the approval of this pipeline. He's kicked the can down the road, all because of pressure from guys like you. Are you celebrating all the loss of jobs? Do you have some hybrid vehicle that runs on broken dreams?
With that, please join me in giving a warm Corvallis welcome to Mr. Bill McKibben.
Thank you for that extremely kind introduction, and I gotta say, one of the reasons that I do not own a TV is so I'll never have to watch myself on TV. So I'm very glad we stopped the clip before we actually got to me talking. It must be said that Stephen Colbert is the most nerve-wracking. I'm quite happy to go. You know, I've been on Bill O'Reilly and Sean Hannity said, no problem. You know what they're going to say. You know how it's going to go. Colbert, it could go absolutely anywhere. And so you just sort of hang on see if you can survive with your dignity more or less intact, and you've made it through. Look, what a pleasure to get to be with you. And at the end of a magnificent day here, I've been with students of all kinds all day long with great fun, punctuated by spectacular meals. One of the things I was saying at dinner, one of the smartest things I ever did was write about local food, because now people feel the need to ply me with it when I go visit them. And no place more than here. I know that all of you have just come from meals of local morel mushrooms and excellent Oregon Pinot Noirs and whatever it is that you all are. It's amazing that you were able to kind of waddle out here to join me tonight, and I'm grateful for you doing it. And it makes me feel, frankly, all the worse for the fact that my role in life is essentially a professional bummer-outer of people, and I apologize in advance, and I will try to end at a hopeful place, but we are going to go through the valley for a moment first, because I know you all know about global warming and climate and all that, but to understand properly the scale of the remedies we need requires understanding the scale of the problem. We need, in essence, to be on the same page for the kind of work that I'm doing, and that I hope you'll join us in, those of you who haven't already, for that to make sense. So let's talk for a minute in just the frankest terms about where we are and what's going on right now. I did write the first sort of book for a general audience about climate way back in 1989, i.e. before many of you were born, and the truth is,
We basically knew everything we needed to know about global warming back then. We knew that when you burn coal and gas and oil, you put carbon into the atmosphere, and we knew that the molecular structure of carbon trapped heat that would otherwise radiate back out to space. Okay, that's the essential bottom line. The only thing we did not know 2 decades ago was exactly how fast and how hard this was going to pinch. And really the story of the last 20 years is it's pinching harder and faster than we thought it was going to. I wrote a kind of bookend book to the end of Nature a couple of years ago, a book with an odd title, Earth, but spelled wrong, E-A-A-R-T-H. You have to kind of channel your inner Schwarzenegger to pronounce it correctly. Earth, you know, is the title, I think. And the conceit of the title was that we'd already changed the Earth enough that it deserved a new name. This, you know, still the same number of continents, gravity still apply, but very different in profound ways, many of which have, you know, been studied here as much as any place on Earth. If you look around our planet, there are substantial differences from the time when I was born. The ocean is about 30% more acid than it was as seawater absorbs carbon from the atmosphere. That's a remarkable change in a short period of time for something that we, you know, use as our metaphor to describe vastness. The idea that we could actually have changed the chemistry of seawater seems almost unbelievable. But then, of course, we've done other things. I see there's 1 or 2 people here like me old enough to remember when those first pictures came back from Apollo 8 of the world, this beautiful blue-white marble spinning in the black void of space. Those pictures are as out of date as my high school yearbook picture is. There's about 40% less ice in the summer in the Arctic than there was then. Okay, just stunning changes. I could go on adducing proofs like this much of the day, but I won't bother to do it. Let me just talk about what's happened since that book came out, because it provides plenty of example in the last 18 months or 2 years. 2010, last year, was the warmest year for which we have records on this planet. 19 nations set new all-time temperature records, and that itself was a record, and some of them were wild. We were on the phone on one day with our 350.org crew in Pakistan, and one of them said, somebody said, it's hot here today in Pakistan. This was July, and I was surprised to hear him say that, because it's always hot in Pakistan in July, and why would you remark on it? He said, no, it's really hot. We just set the new all-time Asia temperature record here today. It's 129 degrees. Like, okay, that is indeed hot. And when you have heat like that, things happen. We could talk about the many, many, many effects. Let me focus just on one, because I think it provides powerful example, and because I think if there's one physical fact that will help explain the progress of this century that we're now entering, it's probably the fact that warm air holds more water vapor than cold. Okay? That basic physical fact is going to prove of enormous importance. The atmosphere already is about 4% moister on average than it was 40 years ago. That is an enormous change in a basic physical parameter of the Earth, one that probably hasn't changed anything like that in the 10,000 years of the Holocene. But the Holocene is over. It's ended in the lifetimes of the people in this room, and we're moving on to something else. And one of the features of that something else is more water in the atmosphere. That means in dry, arid areas, more evaporation and more drought. Summer of 2010, it was Russia's turn for that. They had the greatest heat wave they'd ever had. You remember pictures of smoke from those peat fires billowing through Moscow. That was bad, but the real problem was that they had enormous shortfall in their grain harvest, so drought and heat stricken, and so Russia stopped all grain export to the rest of the world. They turned around ships and trains and took them back to their granaries. And in a normal year, since Russia is the third biggest grain exporter on the planet, that caused the price of wheat and corn and just suddenly spike. It went up almost 70%, and it stayed almost that high ever since because we've had crop failures in place after place after place. North China had a huge drought, parts of Western Europe, and of course, at the moment, horrific drought in the Horn of Africa and in the American Southwest, where Texas and Oklahoma and New Mexico are coping with a dryness deeper even than the dryness of the Dust Bowl years. A few weeks ago, there was a tremendous firestorm in the suburbs of Austin. Many houses destroyed, some people killed. The head of the Texas Forest Firefighting Service said never before, that human beings have never fought fire in conditions like this in all of human history. And he was right. There was almost no humidity, and the temperature was off the charts, and it was just a conflagration. The effect of all that, among other things, increase in the price of food, is that the number of hungry people on Earth has spiked in the last 2 years, up a few hundred million. Okay? Because for us, a 70% increase in the price of corn might be trouble, but not that much. You pay more for the box than you do for the corn when you buy the cornflakes, you know. But if you go out every morning and buy cornmeal to make your family tortillas for dinner, well, a 70% increase in the price means you're not eating as much as you want to be. And that's what many of our brothers and sisters around the world are doing tonight. Okay? Once that water's up in the air, water vapor only stays in the atmosphere 6 or 7 days on average. It's coming down. We've loaded the dice for deluge and downpour and flood, and place after place is throwing snake eyes. Pakistan last August, there's a region up in the Khyber Pass that normally gets about 3 feet of rain in a year, and it got 12 feet of rain in a week. And that caused the Indus River to swell so far out of its banks that about a quarter of the country of Pakistan was submerged and about 20 million people homeless for a while. Many of them still out of their homes, and there was terrific flooding there again this fall. At Christmas time last year, it was Queensland in Australia, and you saw the pictures. There aren't as many TV cameras in Vietnam or the Philippines or Sri Lanka, so you didn't see those pictures, but they were just as intense. This spring, it was our continent, the Mississippi and Missouri, had absolutely record flows and levees breaching and everything else. That's because record snowpack melted in the high plains. Record snowpack is what you get when you have record rainfall and the temperature's below 32 degrees. And as it melted, there was record spring rainfall, and soon there was just unmanageable volumes of water pouring down those rivers. My neck of the woods in Vermont took it in the neck in August. Hurricane Irene came wandering up the east coast of the United States. It wasn't really that strong a hurricane in terms of its wind speed, but it encountered record sea surface temperatures off New York and New Jersey, and so it was able to just soak up water like a sponge and carry it up north and dumped it on Vermont. Statistically, it was completely an almost impossible rainstorm. We broke our old rainfall, one-day rainfall records, not by, like a quarter of an inch or a millimeter. We broke them by 25 and 30%. Binghamton, New York broke its one-day rainfall record by 60%. Okay? This should not even be physically possible, except that we're on a new Earth, as I have said, and one of the proofs of that is, you probably saw those pictures of covered bridges that had been there for 200 years, taking everything nature had to throw at them, just washing away down rivers. Well, much of Vermont is still just rack and ruin, and it's going to be a long time before it's back to where it was, and a lot of money. And if it happens again next year, or the year after, or the year after that, we're loading the dice for it to do, I don't know what we'll do, us or anyone else. Here are the things, and I should add, get obsessed about Vermont because it's where I live, but in the 6 or 8 weeks since, the same thing happened in Ghana, where they had the worst flooding they've ever seen in Accra. It happened across Central America, where 500 people died, and the president of El Salvador said it was the worst natural disaster in the country's history. If you go home tonight and Google flooding in Bangkok, you will see the remarkable images of one of the world's great cities, a cradle of Buddhist civilization, just underwater, huge parts of it, from the record monsoon rains flowing slowly back towards the sea. Two things I want you just to bear in mind. One, not only is this a great practical problem, it is a deep moral and ethical problem. Places like Vermont take it on the chin some of the time, but the places that get hit hardest so far tend to be the places that have done the least to cause this problem. Okay? And that puts a sort of burden on those of us who have done the most to cause this problem. Second thing to bear in mind, we are at the beginning of this. We're near the start of this movie. So far, we've put enough carbon in the atmosphere to trap about 3/4 of a watt of extra solar energy per square meter of the Earth's surface. And that's been enough to raise the temperature of the planet 1 degree. And that's been enough to do the things that I described. We think there's about another degree in the pipeline already from carbon that we've already emitted. Some of that heat's being held in the oceans for a while, but not for that long. Worse, the climatologists who've been right about everything so far are robust in their confident prediction that unless we get our act together quickly, and by getting our act together, I mean unless we get off coal and gas and oil far more rapidly than any government on the planet is planning to right now, that we'll see a temperature increase of 5 or 6 degrees before the century is out. And much of that will be locked in the next little while, okay? That would be extremely bad news. A couple of years ago, a team at University of Washington and Stanford did the just straightforward experiment of asking what would happen to grain yields from our major crops were we to increase temperatures like that. Never mind drought, never mind flood, just the effects of elevated temperature, because of course all those plants evolved in the Holocene just like us, okay? What they found was that from this point in, we can expect to see yield, for every degree of temperature increase, we should expect to see yields go down about 10%. Right? You can do this math in your head. You know enough about this planet to be able to predict what will happen to war and peace, to social justice, to progress, to development, to women's rights, to public health, to all the things we desperately care about if there are 20 or 30% fewer calories on this planet than there are now. Nothing good will happen. We cannot let that happen. We absolutely have to stop it. It is the worst thing that has ever happened in the history of this earth, at least of our time on it, and we must figure out how to stop it. And that's what I want to talk about just for a few minutes. How it is we might be able to rein this in. The first thing to be said is many people in their professions have already done their jobs. The scientific method has worked. Okay, it's been vindicated more powerfully in this than any other thing we've ever faced, I think. We've taken a very difficult problem in atmospheric chemistry and physics, subjected it to that dialectic, and in the course of a decade or two reached a working consensus about what's going on, its scale, its future, what we need to do. A powerful vindication of the scientific method. The engineering method has worked pretty darn well too. 15 or 20 years ago, when we talked about solar power and wind power and things, we mostly did it with our fingers crossed because it was something that was off in the future. No longer so. We know, I know we know how to do things because that's how I power my house, you know, and it works fine. The failure's not with science or engineering. The failure's someplace else. Let me tell you a story that I was telling people earlier today, just because I was reminded of it, and it really brought this home to me. I was in China doing a story for National Geographic about China and energy earlier this year, and China's made a lot of poor decisions. They put a lot of coal-fired power plants up, and they're now contributing a lot of carbon to the atmosphere, but they've made some pretty smart decisions too. One of them is really to emphasize solar hot water, an easy technology that provides provides hot water for domestic use easily and cheaply. 250 million Chinese, 250 million Chinese, when they take a shower at night, the hot water is coming from solar thermal panels on the roof, compared with about 1% or less of Americans, okay? So I spent a day with this guy, Huang Ming, the engineer who had built Hemin Solar, the biggest company doing this work. They installed 60 million of these solar arrays around China. A very rich man and a very good man, engineer who's spent his whole life trying to make this happen. And at the end of our talk, he said, come into my little museum here next to my office, a little anteroom. And in it, among other things, the sort of pride of place was a rusting, peeling solar panel. He said, you know what that is? I said, no, I don't know what that is. He said, that's one of the panels that Jimmy Carter put on the White House in 1979 and Ronald Reagan took down in 1985, okay? Scientific method worked, engineering method worked, political method has failed completely, completely, okay? We've had a 20-year perfect bipartisan record of accomplishing nothing in Washington. Okay? And it's important, I think, to understand why that is. For a long time, our notion was, and Dr. Spinrad will know this as well as anyone, I think, the sort of notion was we would have smart scientists go and sit with policymakers and explain to them that the most dangerous thing that had ever occurred was going on, and they would do something to stop it eventually. And that was a perfectly valid and rational thing to do, and it didn't work. And the reason it didn't work was because, well, rational people were talking calmly in one ear, the fossil fuel industry was bellowing in the other ear. Threats and promises that delayed and prevented any action. They are the most profitable human enterprise ever by a large margin. Exxon made more money last year than any company in the history of money. It doesn't take a huge amount of that in order to delay and stall and prevent things in Washington, which is all they want to do. That's the crux of the problem that we face, okay? And so solving it means, since we're never gonna have enough money to match the fossil fuel industry, figuring out some other currencies in which to work. And that's what we were talking about this afternoon with this group of inspired activists that Kathy and others had brought together, and that was so much fun to talk to. What those alternate currencies are, what they really are movements, building movements in order to really start to see some change. I'll just tell you briefly. Well, first, let me say that as I talk about this stuff, I'll talk about it confidently, but I don't really know anything about building movements. No one really does. It's not something, you know, I've been talking about science for 20 minutes and can provide you all the footnotes, but this stuff's more art than science, and a kind of dark art at that, and certainly not my art. You know, I'm a writer by trade. I'm an introvert. It's pleasant to be here with you, but left to my own devices, I'd really rather be home in my room typing, you know? But at some point, I figured out that writing about this stuff wasn't enough, that we had to take some serious action. I was telling people earlier today, and the point may have been the point at which I went to Bangladesh, and while I was there, they had their first big outbreak of dengue fever. A hideous mosquito-borne disease that's now spreading like wildfire across Asia and South America because the mosquito Aedes aegypti that transmits it truly likes the warm, wet world that we're building on its behalf. You know, if you were watching our planet through a telescope and trying to figure out what the hell we were thinking about changing our atmosphere, a reasonable hypothesis would be that we had embarked on a kind of planetary mosquito ranching enterprise, you know, and this was the precondition for making it happen. I spent a lot of time while I was in Dhaka in Bangladesh in the slums, so eventually I got bit by the wrong mosquito too, and I got dengue, and I was sick as I'd ever been. And I went to the clinic, and it was almost as big as this room, maybe bigger, and just people on cots lying there shivering and dying. And my main thought was, how unfair is this? 150 million people in Bangladesh, but when the UN tries to measure how much carbon the country emits, you can't even get a number. It's just a rounding error, you know, because they're not using enough fossil fuel to matter. 4% of us in this country are responsible for more than a third of the global warming gases in the atmosphere right now, because CO2 has a residence time of about 100 years, and we've been putting it out for a very long time in big numbers. And when I saw that and sort of reflected on that, I wanted to do, but I, you know, as I say, I'm not an organizer. So we came home and started thinking about what to do. And one of the problems that you quickly face when you start thinking about global organizing is the globe is a big place, and everybody on it insists on speaking their own language. So you got to figure out how to get, you know, it's not an easy obstacle to get across. We were both thrilled and horrified to read a paper that Jim Hansen at NASA and his team published in January of 2008 that said, we now know enough about carbon to know how much is too much. Any value for carbon in the atmosphere greater than 350 parts per million is not compatible with the planet on which civilization developed and to which life on Earth is adapted. Very strong language for scientists to use. Stronger still when you know, as Dr. Spinrad pointed out, that at the moment, wherever you are, in, you know, any place in this world, the atmosphere is above 390 parts per million and rising 2 parts per million per year. We're already way too high. That's why Pakistan drowns, Texas burns, whatever. That was the horrifying part. The slightly thrilling part was realizing that now maybe we had a key that would allow us to do some global organizing, because Arabic numerals cross linguistic boundaries. You wouldn't normally choose a scientific data point as your rallying cry, but this one at least worked everywhere around the world, so we decided to try it out. When I say we, I mean me and 7 undergraduates at Middlebury, where I teach. They were seniors, so they weren't done with school, but they were done with school, more or less. And 7, we had no money or anything, but 7 was the correct number. There are indeed 7 continents, so each one of them took one, and off we went to work. I said earlier, the guy who got the Antarctic also had to take responsibility for the internet, because it's kind of its own landmass, you know, and off we went to work. And our work was to find people like ourselves around the world. And most of the world, there's not a category called environmentalist, but there are people who work on food and on public health and on women's issues and on war and peace and development and progress and all the things you can't have on a planet, all the things that nobody's working on in Thailand right now because they're just trying to keep, you know, people's heads above water as the floods roll through. So we found those, or tried to find those people. We did training camps for young people in Turkey, for Central Asia, in the Caribbean, in Africa, you know, trained young people up, and it was fun. And we said, you know what, the thing we need to work on is we're going to have one big day that's a kind of first coming out party for this thing, October 24th, 2009, so just over 2 years ago, and we said, we want you on that day to do something. And we had no idea how it was going to turn out. The 8 of us were that week in a little borrowed office down in Lower Manhattan, one room around a table with our laptops open, you know, kind of waiting. We got the sense, I told this earlier today, so I'm going to tell it again because it made me happy to think about it. We got the sense it might work 2 days early because we got a phone call from one of these people that we'd worked with, a 17-year-old, Lily, in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. And she called and she was in tears on the phone and she said, the government's taken away our permit for Saturday. We can't do our demonstration like we'd planned. We're going to do it today before they can stop us, but we're really sorry. We really apologize. We don't want to spoil it for other people. We so wanted to do it when everybody else was going to do it. And we have 10,000 people out in the street right now. And Addis Ababa chanting 350. And, you know, I was like, it's okay, don't worry about the date, it's all right. And after that, the pictures just rolled in from everywhere. Before we were done, there had been 5,100 demonstrations in 181 countries. CNN said it was the most widespread day of political action in the planet's history. And I'm just going to flip through a few of these. The second one actually came from U.S. troops in Afghanistan. They made a 350 with sandbags, said we're parking our Humvee for the weekend and walking, you know. And they just started coming in from everywhere. But the thing I want you to focus on is this, okay? I've spent my life having people tell me that environmentalism is some luxury for rich white people, and if we had to worry about where your next meal was coming from, you wouldn't be an environmentalist. And it turns out that that's just nonsense. Most of the people that we worked with around the world were poor and black and brown and Asian and young, because that's what most of the world is made up of. And strangely, they're just as concerned about the future as anybody else. Maybe more so, because the future bears down heavily on you in those, you know, places. And so pictures were coming from places I'd never heard of, places I had. 300 big demonstrations across India, the India Youth Climate Network. Places I couldn't identify, someplace in Buddhist Asia. I just liked the picture. Places of extreme poverty. There's dugout canoes on the Congo, someplace above Kinshasa. You know, they didn't have a digital camera. They took a picture, developed it in a home darkroom. It didn't come out so well, so they had to write in what their banner had said. But there you were, you know, near where Conrad, in his Eurocentric way, had described the heart of darkness. And what do you know? People were deeply involved, and there were pictures like that coming from all over the world. Istanbul had big floodings. We had 5 or 6 big demonstrations there. Just beautiful. So there's the Space Needle in Seattle. Hopefully those guys didn't stop for too long to, you know, do their thing. Just magnificent pictures all over the place. Wonderful involvement for really the first time in this kind of thing of religious leaders of all kinds. There's the head of Muslim South Africa. Next to him, the head of kind of indigenous traditions. Behind him in the scarlet, Archbishop Tutu's successor as Anglican Archbishop. Pentecostal school in Ghana. That's Billy Graham's alma mater. You wouldn't have had an environmental demonstration there even a few years ago, and it's a very good sign that it's happening. I'd been to Bethlehem to organize a few weeks before. Not easy to get to, but the Dead Sea shrinking very rapidly as temperatures rise. Too many military checkpoints in the way for an easy sort of one big thing. So the Jordanians said, we'll do the 3 on our shore. The Palestinians said, we'll do the 5 in Palestine. The Israelis said, we'll do the 0 along our beach, you know. Very powerful to see. Lots and lots of this kind of, you know, we were picking iconic places. So in India, palaces, but this was an autumn Saturday in the US. So, you know, there were the Syracuse cheerleaders helping us out. You know, just place after place after place. And it was very moving. Soweto, heartland of resistance to apartheid, they did 350 bungee jumps, but the important thing was they sent us a note saying we strung the bungee line between the cooling towers of a defunct coal-fired power plant. This is the highest and best use for coal-fired power plants going forward. Okay? So there's my daughter is in there someplace, because those are our sap buckets, you know, in Vermont. We don't want to lose our maple forest. China, not an easy place to do this kind of thing. One of the 300 demonstrations did get broken up by the police, but the others went ahead. There's the China Youth Climate Network making a human wind turbine. Behind them, the edge of the largest wind farm on Earth, you know. Just beautiful, powerful the Maldives. One of the most wonderful places on Earth. Real paradise. 1,200 islands strung across the equator in the Indian Ocean. White sand beaches, coral reefs, could not be more beautiful. Highest point in the archipelago, about 1 meter above sea level. That culture's been there 5,000 years. The odds of it lasting this century are pretty small, okay? But they're doing everything they can. In practical terms, they've announced that they'll be the first carbon neutral nation on Earth by 2020. They're building wind towers as fast as they can. And in symbolic terms, there's the Student Government Association holding a meeting in the lagoon. The president, Mohammed Nasheed, of that entirely Muslim nation, taught his whole cabinet how to scuba dive. They held an underwater cabinet meeting against their dying coral reef and passed a 350 resolution to send to the UN. Big trees in Tasmania, not a good idea to cut down big trees. There's a lot of carbon in there. You know, for a day or two, it was the biggest story on Google News. And the reason, I think, was that things were so unlikely. I mean, there's the highest mountain in the Antarctic, but more to the point, places that were probably, in a sense, harder to reach. People who didn't look to Western editors anyway, like they were environmentalists, you know. If you look at the zero there from Yemen, it's all women in full black burqa, okay? Not, to our eyes, sort of Sierra Club members, but absolutely the same in their hope for the future. Oil-rich sheikhs in Abu Dhabi, but maybe smarter oil-rich sheikhs than our local variety. They're taking a lot of their money. The UN just moved its renewable energy laboratory to Abu Dhabi because they want to be in on that. If you look behind them, you'll see the edge of the largest solar array on our Earth. Just beautiful pictures, and I confess, a file of 500 or 600 that were just labeled 350 adorable. And they were adorable. That girl in the middle just kills me every time I look at her. Completely adorable and very bittersweet. You know, in 1911, though we were going to have a difficult century, there was no way you could sit down and say, you are going to be a refugee in 50 years. But in our time, we can, unless we do the right thing. I wish I could tell you that all this great action, including wonderful stuff here in Oregon, had completely had done the job. 6 weeks later, we went to Copenhagen to the big climate summit. And we were able to convince 117 nations to sign on to this 350 target, which we thought was good, but they were, of course, the wrong 117 nations, all the poor ones, okay? And the rich addicts, led by us, were unwilling to do a thing, and so the meeting fizzled. The movie did not end as it was supposed to end. And 6 months later, the US Senate, then with 60 Democrats, couldn't even bring itself to take a vote on the most mild, tame, tepid climate bill you could ever imagine. They were so cowed and scared of the fossil fuel industry that they would not even take a vote. Okay. And I was worried that all this would just cause this whole thing, people would just get so discouraged, but happily people were made of sterner stuff than I am, and the next two falls in 2010, and then again a few weeks ago, we had other huge, big, much bigger days of global action. The one we just came through was particularly beautiful. It was called Moving Planet, and it was all about bicycles mostly all over the world, and couldn't have been more beautiful to be a part of and to see. So we'll keep doing all this because we need to keep doing powerful education about all this, spreading the word, getting people involved, and it's really important that you help us. And I hope you'll go to 350.org and sign up, but you know what? It won't be enough by itself. As I said earlier, the hard lesson we're learning is that merely explaining the problem to our leaders is not enough. And we're going to also have to try and force their hand a little bit. And one of the alternate currencies in which we're going to have to work is our bodies. I'll just tell you quickly the story of the last 4 or 5 months of my life, this fight about this pipeline, the Keystone Pipeline, which was a big deal because the place from which it came, these tar sands of northern Alberta, turned out to be the second largest pool of carbon on Earth, second only to the oil fields of Saudi Arabia. It was burning oil fields of Saudi Arabia more than anything else that raised the temperature a degree. But when we started in on that, we did not know about climate change. If we find the second Saudi Arabia and just do the same damn thing with it, then we are idiots, you know? There's just no other way around it. Jim Hansen and his team did some data crunching at the beginning of the summer and said, if you could somehow torch off all the oil in Alberta tonight, which thank God you can't, but if you could all at once, you would raise the carbon concentration of the atmosphere from 390 parts per million to 540 parts per million, okay? There's a lot of carbon up there. And so we decided, I mean, what Hansen said was, in that period, if we tap heavily into these tar sands, it is essentially game over for the climate. Now, that seemed to have no impact, really, in Washington. Everybody just assumed the thing would keep getting built. I don't know why it would have no impact if your most important climatologist tells you that something that you're doing is going to destroy the climate. You'd think your reaction would be, okay, don't do that, let's do something else. But that was not the reaction. So we decided we better see what we could do. And a few of us sent out a letter asking people, please, to come to Washington and to get arrested, to do civil disobedience, very civil disobedience in front of the White House. We sat down in what's called the Postcard Zone in front of the White House, where you're not supposed to sit because a lot of people need to take pictures of the White House, okay? And the first batch of us, the first day, ended up, police didn't, were trying to sort of deter us, so we spent 3 days in Central Cell Block in D.C., which was exactly as much fun as it sounds like it probably would be. And after that, people just kept coming, one wave after another for 2 weeks. Before we were done, 1,253 people had been arrested, the largest civil disobedience action in 35 years. And it was very, as I say, very civil. One of the things I told people was, if you want to come, we want you in a necktie or a dress, okay? Because one of the visual points we want to make here is we are not radicals, okay? Radicals are people who will alter the chemical composition of the atmosphere in order to make money, okay? That's a radical thing to do. It's so radical that it's almost, you couldn't, if you wrote like a Bond film where it would be sort of too outlandish for the villain to be like altering the chemical composition of the atmosphere, all right? But that's what people at Exxon get up every day figuring out how they're going to do more of, all right? So in that sense, those of us whose main desire is to have a planet something like the one we were born onto are conservatives. There is no other sort of way to say it, and we wanted a way to do that. And so everybody coming and getting arrested did its job. It was the ante that people tossed in the pot, their bodies, in order to get us in the game. And then the game was on all fall long, and every place that President Obama went, campus to campus, town to town, he'd find crowds of 100, 200, 300, 400 people chanting, "Yes, we can stop the pipeline," wherever he went, and people visiting in large numbers his campaign offices saying, "We were the people who were here in 2008 helping. You remember us? And we're happy to help again, but we need you to actually do the things you said you were going to do," okay? Especially, as in this case, when Congress isn't in the way and it's up to you entirely whether to do this or not. And 10 or 12 days ago, we returned to Washington, a week ago Sunday. And we circled, this time we no need to get arrested, we circled the White House. We didn't know if we could. No one had done it in a long time, and there's a large security perimeter around it and things, so we didn't know if we'd have enough people to do it, and we were sort of worried that it would look bad if we didn't and things. We needn't have worried. Enough people arrived that we were stacked 5 deep, shoulder to shoulder, most of the way around this mile-long circumference of the White House. It was very beautiful and very respectful. Every banner was just a quote from Barack Obama in 2008. "Time to end the tyranny of oil, In my administration, the rise of the oceans will begin to slow and the planet will begin to heal." It was a very beautiful day. And oddly enough, it kind of worked. 4 days later, last week ago today, the administration said that it was sending this pipeline back to the State Department. They didn't say we're not going to do it. They said we're sending it back to the State Department for a full review that will take into account things like climate change. And they said, not coincidentally, this review would take until 2013, okay? Not an accident, I think, of chronological timing. This is probably enough to kill this particular pipeline, okay? We don't know for sure, and it could resurrect itself and whatever, but chances are this one's, in trouble. If nothing else, TransCanada, which everybody who built wanted to build the pipeline, which everybody said was going to win. There was a poll in something called the National Journal, this Washington kind of institution, and they had 300 energy insiders, all the congressional people and lobbyists and everybody else. They did it in about a month ago exactly, and 97% of them said that this thing would be approved by the end of this year. Instead, there are now huge piles, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of steel pipe that TransCanada had pre-positioned all along the pipeline route, so confident were they of victory, now rusting away, which makes me much happier than it should, were I a more moral person than I am, you know. Big story today in Reuters saying this is causing trouble for the tar sands industry all over the world, and that the Europeans may now decide not to let this stuff into Europe, and so on and so forth. And I was in Vancouver yesterday, meeting with all the First Nations people, all the Indigenous people who are working super hard to block the possibility that they'll run pipelines west to British Columbia, and they think they can do it. It's exciting to see. It is a very small victory in the scheme of things. You know, the same week that we won that victory, the International Energy Agency announced that carbon emissions around this world had grown, without any help from the tar sands, had grown more last year than any year in history. Okay, just spewing out off the charts, faster than the worst IPCC prediction of some years ago. So a very small victory that does not even come close to solving not only the tar sands problem, much less global warming. The only thing it does do, really, is remind us of what we're gonna have to do if we're actually gonna solve this problem, which is actually be willing to be out there, and not most of us in jail most of the time, hopefully that won't be, but maybe sometimes. And at any rate, involved, deeply involved, willing to care, willing to work, willing to be on the line, willing to be uncomfortable, willing to do what it takes. I cannot guarantee you we're going to win this fight. There are scientists who think we waited too long to get started with climate change, and there's just too much momentum, and we're too near kind of feedback loops that will exacerbate this. There are political scientists who think there is just too much money on the other side for real wins to accumulate. They could well be right, those political scientists. If you were a betting person, I think you'd be forced to bet that they were right, because we've lost for 20 years, far more often than we've won. But that's not really a bet you're allowed to make. The only real thing that a morally awake person can do when something this bad is happening is get up in the morning and try to figure out how to change those odds some, with no guarantee of success. The only thing I can guarantee, and I can guarantee it strongly, because I've spent the last 4 years in more or less constant motion around the planet spewing carbon behind me, the only thing I can guarantee is that all over the world, in places like the Maldives and Bangladesh and in every other place in the world, there are rooms full of people like this room tonight where people are hard at work and determined and ready to go to work. Many of them in places where people have done nothing to cause this problem, and yet they are gracious enough to be in solidarity with the rest of us and be doing what they can. And what they can is less than what we can, because they have less leverage. They're not producing enough carbon in their own places to really reduce it much, you know, but we could. It's always a great honor to be in rooms like that. And it's a great honor to be in this room tonight, because I know there are lots of people in this room who have already done all kinds of work, and lots who will do much, much more in the years to come. And I can't guarantee you're going to win, and I can just say it'll be a great privilege to get to stand shoulder to shoulder with you and fight in the years ahead. Thank you all very much. You're too kind, but I'll give you a present for your kindness. This was another picture that came in right afterwards.
Thank you, Bill. We've built in some time for some questions and answers, so I'll try to keep track of those of you with your hands raised who would like to speak. We'll accommodate as much as we can before we move on to the book signing in just a few moments here. Yes, in the middle, please. Right there. Yes, you.
Thank you. Is that your presentation this afternoon? It was just as good as this. And you were talking about activism, of course, and how we all need to be more activist, and what kind of activism can we do? You know, you gave us a lot of examples that we talked about afterwards. That was very exciting. One thing that has struck me is, say, those of us who believe that, you know, we really need to go back down to 350. And those scientists who've been doing the research to show us this have had the problem of communication, as you said. And it's more of a political thing. Mm-hmm. And we've gone after, like, Exxon, the people who sell us this stuff and make the money off the stuff. Would it be valid to consider those of us who know this stuff and those who study this stuff as a form of activism to sort of say, I ain't going to fly no more, I ain't going to drive a car no more, I'm not going to buy this stuff no more?
Sure. That's a very interesting and important question. And it's really the thing we've done far more of than we have in sort of going after the fossil fuel industry and things. There have been years now of people, you know, telling everybody to change their light bulbs and, you know, do those kind of alter their lives and things, and all of which is important, you know. And of course, you know, I'm a good person to ask about this because I'm an enormous hypocrite in that regard. You know, I've been, as I say, just all over the world for years now trying to organize this movement, but every bit of it's come, you know, with carbon burnt. I'm flying all the time. I'll be in the air tomorrow. I think for me, the answer is, of course, don't fly and do all stuff frivolously and don't waste energy and whatever. But don't make that the absolute epitome of your work, because you can't make it mathematically add up in the time that we have, okay? If we're going to work by addition, if you're going to change your life and then your brother-in-law will see it and change his life and his next-door neighbor will see it and change his life and whatever, it's not going to happen fast enough. We're also going to need to work by multiplication. That means changing laws and changing, among probably more than anything else, the price signal that we get about carbon. It's going to mean putting a price on carbon that reflects the damage it does in the environment. And the reason we don't do that is because of the power of the fossil fuel industry. They have a sweetheart deal. They're allowed to use the atmosphere as an open sewer into which to dump their principal waste product, carbon, for free. And until that ends, we won't see change on the scale that will really do anything about this stuff. So I completely hear you. And you know, when I'm home, I'm good and virtuous on carbon. You know, we have the, I was telling people earlier today, we have a plaque on our house saying it's the most efficient house built in Vermont the year it was built, and it's all run off the sun and all. But I ruin all that the minute I, you know, head to the airport and go out to try and organize. So I don't really know what the right answer is. I hope that the work we're doing is enough to make up for at least my own, you know, spreading of fossil fuel. But I do think that the most important work that all of us have to do is our work as citizens, to be politically active in a systematic way. And we've tried at 350.org to figure out how you can do that in your local community and still have it add up to something on a large scale politically, because it combines with this work of people around the world. And we'll keep doing that. And we'll also keep trying to find these campaigns like the Keystone thing that allow us to, so you know, I had a bunch of people before this march in Washington say, should I come in here? you know, is it worth the carbon to come to Washington to be part of this, to get arrested or to be around the White House? And I kept telling people, you know what, I think in this case it is. I think we'll make a strong enough statement, and I think if we can shut down this pipeline, it'll have other effects, and I think you should come. And I don't know whether that was right or not. We shall see.
Okay, we heard from this section. Over there with your hand, please.
Thank you. Bill, I know you've been traveling around a lot, but you probably know that last week, Bill, I know you've been traveling around a lot, but you probably know that last week the International Energy Agency gave us an assessment that said essentially we've got 5 years left till 2017 to lock in or to not get locked into a scenario where it will be almost impossible for us to use alternative energy as a way of stopping going beyond 450 parts per million. And that 5 years, for all your good work and all the good work of everyone in the world, it seems a little short for me to see that all developing within the next 5 years. So I've got a couple of questions. One, do you think it might be a little late to just rely on alternative energy? And two, given the fact, and I know you're a supporter of biogenic carbon sequestration, given the fact that we're already over 350, considerably so, would it make more sense to, instead of spending a lot of effort relying on trying to get the government to do squat, which they probably won't, would it make more sense to go ahead and get the populace, these types of groups of people, to go wholeheartedly and full scale into biogenic sequestration, which is something that people can take power of by themselves without having to wait for Exxon or Enron or Senator this or Senator that?
Look, we got to do, first of all, it's not just renewable energy that we need to rely on. The first thing we need to rely on, and we really have to go to work on it, is serious energy conservation, because we use way, way more energy than we need to. And if we, if we used a lot less, it would be pretty easy, as Spinrad was saying in his introduction, it would be a little like losing weight by cutting your hair. And it would create a society where it was much more plausible to imagine the sun and the wind and such things providing much of the power we need. So that's job one, okay? Yeah, look, carbon sequestration, if you can figure out how to do biochar and changing cropping practices and stuff, is good. It can't get you numbers that, of the scale we need, at least if we continue to pour carbon into the atmosphere, okay? That's job one. It's like you've got a bathtub, all right? And there are some drains on the bathtub. Oceans and forests sequester some carbon, and we can probably figure out land use practices that will increase somewhat that sequestration. But it's really not going to matter if you just keep pouring more water into the tub all the time, all right? So I think that that the hard part is that part, is the restraint. And if we don't get it down, if we keep increasing the amount of carbon we pour in, nothing we're going to do is going to matter very much. We're already sort of over the brink in certain ways, and we're very close to it. So I got to say, I continue to think the greatest leverage is in quickly shutting off coal and oil and gas as much as we can. And you know what? You're right that it's a difficult political battle, but there are times when it feels, today, about an hour ago, that, the first thing we turned to once we were done this Keystone thing was this fracking fight out east, and we told everybody they had to come to the Delaware River Basin Commission big vote on Monday. We're going to do civil disobedience there and try to, hope that they would not allow fracking across the Delaware River Basin. And about an hour ago, they decided that they weren't going to have the meeting after all because the governor of Delaware had switched his vote. And so at least for the moment, that part of the world is safe for a little while from fracking. We're kind of used to losing, and it would be good to try and get used to winning a little bit and see what happens, see what kind of role we could get on. It's possible that these guys, they're enormously strong, They have all the money in the world. But there's another sense in which they're a little bit of paper tigers too, because they don't have that many people, you know? And we have some tools that we can get at them with to do some organizing. When we started 350.org, we took every penny that we could scrape together, about $40,000, and spent it on our website, okay? And it was a good website. It works in like 11 or 12 languages, and it's beautiful and lively and full of pictures. Well, look, Exxon could and probably did spend $40 million on its website, okay? But it's no better than ours. In fact, it's much, much more boring. It's just, you know, endless pictures of, you know, penguins and all the other things that it's driving to extinction, you know? And so we can match them some, you know? We're beginning to find playing fields on which we have a chance. It's just whether or not people get involved. And you know what? Political change takes fewer people than you think. How many people are in this room tonight?
Several hundred?
Probably 400 people in here tonight, something like that. 400 people in a concentrated area like this, you know, 400 people would be more than enough to make your congressman think twice about, you know, what he was going to vote about something. I mean, it's amazing. Since not that many people are politically involved, how few it takes to really start changing things around. We'll see. I mean, you know, you may well be right. We may, as I say, if you're going to bet, we're probably going to lose, but we're going to fight. And let's, you know, knock on wood, we get somewhere.
Yes, just here, third row.
You, Bill, spoke about the 4% of us that are producing 30% of the gases, greenhouse gases. And I'm wondering about the increased urbanization of the planet and the rise of megacities. And is there a second wave coming as populations move into the cities in the hundreds of millions? And should we be concerned about that?
Yeah.
What can we do about that?
Well, there's not much, I mean.
You might want to repeat the question.
Yes, that's a good idea. The question is, especially in the developing world, people move into cities off the countryside, isn't that going to generate a big wave of carbon into the atmosphere? And it is. That's essentially what's going on in China. China's now passed the U.S. as the biggest carbon emitter last year or the year before, although in per capita terms, of course, they're well behind us. But that's what's going on. It's not population increase. China's population is essentially stable. It's that they're beginning to consume on a, you know, quasi-American scale. And the best hope for dealing with that is, in China and elsewhere, some kind of real price on carbon that sends a strong signal about every purchasing decision and everything that everybody makes and unconsciously drives us in the right direction. But we won't get that until we beat the power of the fossil fuel industry. That's why these fights are so important. We're up against a great amount of demographic, you know, I mean, this fight's not easy in any way. Not here, not in China. Harder in China because they actually have, you know, I mean, they're actually really poor. There are still 600 million people living in poverty in the Chinese countryside, and it's real poverty. I mean, you see people who look like they're 70 when they're 30, because that's how hard their lives are, okay? And it's not at all hard to understand why they may want a refrigerator or, you know, something like that. And so, you know, that it's going to be hard to absorb all that, and it's all the more reason, and in this part of the world, we have to figure out how to cut down and cut down quickly, and why we have to figure out how we're going to get our act together to transfer serious technological resources north to south so that countries coming up behind China can leapfrog past the fossil fuel thing and go straight to renewable energy. If we can't, then we can't, you just mathematically can't solve the problem.
Yes, just here.
I don't really hit it, but I'll do it. One of the, is this on? One of the challenges that the environmental, progressive, humanist, etc. group of people, which I assume most of this crowd would self-identify as, is that we parse things to death. And I had the circumstance of working in Santa Barbara about 10 years ago, and one of my jobs was to try to advance the cause of renewable energy.
Santa Barbara considers itself to be the birthplace of environmentalism because they had the 1969 oil spill, right? And that never found that less than funny. But when it came to Santa Barbans would talk the talk. Yes, we need alternative energy, but when it came to putting solar panels on roofs, they came out in droves to protest the aesthetic problems. When it came to putting wind turbines and capturing the wind off of the ridges there, it was also protested. What can we do to convince ourselves that we need to stand together, we need to stop quibbling and arguing, and I'm wondering, maybe one of your next projects might be to write a book somewhat entitled, Knock It Off, You Silly Twits.
I think it's really actually a really important question to figure out. You know, on the one hand, this kind of NIMBY response is what we want. We want people concerned about their backyards, about where they live, about their place. That's really been much of the work of, not about the like aesthetic problem of looking at, but you know, we want people to be worried at some level about that, and it's good. But you're right. There's a difference between opposing, you know, an oil pipeline through your backyard and opposing a windmill, you know, down the road, because one is really necessary for our future. And I think that one way to start thinking about it is to not allow ourselves to be entirely, when there are things that we need to oppose, like oil pipelines or whatever, not be entirely sort of NIMBY about it. I wrote a piece earlier this week to start talking about the fact that the farmers and ranchers that we'd worked with in Nebraska on this Keystone stuff and the Native Americans who'd been leading this fight honorably from the beginning were certainly by the end, if not at the beginning of this fight, very involved in a kind of larger view of the world. So they're not, the word we need is not NIMBY, it's sort of NOOP. It's not on our planet, you know? I think that that's right. And I think we need to start thinking some in planetary terms. I was telling people earlier today about this big art project we did last year at 350, where we did these 20 huge installations around the world that took thousands of people. Artists would do these beautiful designs, and then thousands and thousands of people would go link arms or something to form these images. And they were so big you had to view them from a satellite for them to register. And one of the reasons we did it was because we wanted to keep reminding people that we live on a planet. Okay? And that is an easy thing to forget. In day-to-day terms, you live in Corvallis, you know, you don't live on Earth, all right? But it's a planet, just like Jupiter is a planet. It has physical laws that need to be listened to, and so on and so forth. And that kind of constant, maybe the answer to your question is, to the degree that we can think a little bit like a planet, then we might be getting somewhere. And it's one of the reasons that we wanted to do this 350 thing all over the world. If there is one commonality all over the world, it's what's happening to, I mean, carbon dioxide mixes very quickly in the atmosphere. So it's the same CO2 concentration everywhere. And that's a really important thing, I think, to keep reminding people of all the time.
Let's go a little bit further in the back. To the gentleman just there. Yes, please.
I totally agree with you that the tar sands are a really nasty source of energy. But I worry a little bit that, you know, basically we're cutting off one source and we'll supply our energy from another source, drilling in the Gulf of Mexico, importing from Mexico, Venezuela, whatever. And it seems a little bit like the drug war. You know, you try and stop one source and just come someplace else because of the demand. And, you know, people in this country, if you talk about increasing taxes on gasoline to cut down consumption, you know, there's a huge outcry. So how do you reduce the demand for this drug?
So I agree with you. The way that we do it is by increasing the price. Okay, that's the only way to substantially reduce it. But you're right, it's hard to increase the price without causing political backlash. There is, however, a way to do that, and it makes sense. If you go home and Google cap and dividend or fee and dividend, you'll see the approach that pretty much Australia adopted last week, the first industrialized nation to do anything serious about climate. In essence, you put a big tax on oil, gas, coal at the wellhead or the mine gate or whatever, and collect a lot of money from them and cause the price of gas at the pump or whatever to go up, hopefully go up a lot, you know, like to European levels or something. But you take the money you collect, and every month you write each American a check for their share of the sky. If anyone owns the sky, it's us, not Exxon, you know. And so most people would come out ahead. About 80% of people would come out ahead, just people who don't, you know, grossly waste energy. And you could see how that would make it politically palatable to do this kind of thing. And there are bills in Congress. But we're not going to get them passed until we knock heads enough and take, you know, put some dings in the fossil fuel industry so they're at least willing to go to the table and talk and have some kind of discussion. So it's important to do these kind of fights for that reason as much as for stopping particular pipelines and things. One of the things that we're going to do more of, I think I'm going to be more involved in, and I hope you all are more involved in, is this sort of larger fight about corporate power in general. It's outrageous that corporations are treated as people, okay? Because they're not. It's outrageous just for kind of reasons of good kind of mental hygiene. It's a bad idea to call things that which they are not, you know? And corporations are not people. And it's a legal fiction that now is getting us in immense amounts of trouble since the Supreme Court has decided that there are people who can spend, you know, unpeople-sized amounts of money on campaigns. And that I mean, it's just not going to work if we keep doing that. So that's a part of this fight, and it's one of the reasons why Occupy Wall Street is such a good thing, in my opinion. I was really, I've been a kind of I've been to 7 Occupy encampments now, and I'm sort of Occupy tourist, you know, this fall. And, the prettiest one, I've got to say, as you would expect, Occupy Santa Fe, very chic and well arranged, and you know, quite worth it. But when I went down to Occupy Wall Street, you know, I was there early on and got to speak through the human microphone and things. And the thing I just said was, about time, you know. Wall Street has been occupying the atmosphere for the last 30 years, so it's about time we returned the favor, you know. And here we are. And that was good. And I think, you know, it's a shame that the police have cleared everybody out and whatever, but I don't think that the basic underlying message is going to go away anytime soon. It's not fair what's going on, and it's not smart, and it's time for it to stop. And so, you know, if people get more, I told this story earlier today too, but one of the things that's important is that it's not just the usual suspects who are involved in all this stuff. First, at least at the beginning, down at Occupy Wall Street, it was everybody you could possibly imagine, you know. When we got everybody arrested, we said, you know what, college kids are not our target audience for people coming here to do civil disobedience. They haven't been pouring carbon into the atmosphere their whole lives, and right now, when you're 18, might not be the greatest moment in our economy to get an arrest record. So you're not the people that need to come. It's old people that need to come, all right? And that's who did come. We didn't ask people how old they were. We asked them, who was president when you were born? Okay? And the 2 biggest groups were from the FDR administration and the Truman administration. Okay? So it's like, okay, that's good. It made me happy to see that. And that's important, to get everybody involved and not just leave it to people who are like the outspoken people or the political people or the whatever to go do this. It's not going to work if that happens. And it's not going to work if everybody just decides to do exactly the thing only they think is the right response. You've got to figure out what other people are doing at the same time and go help them, you know. You got to have a certain number of people to make a fight, or it's not a fight. It's just, you know, you punching the air, you know. So It's time for that, some of that to really happen. And it's been a great year in that regard. I mean, it started in Tahrir Square and continues, around the world as we speak. So that's good news.
Another one, perhaps please a little further in the back. Here, yes.
About a year ago, I saw a clip where you commented on the upcoming.
Or shout.
About a year ago, I heard a clip where you commented about the upcoming talks in Cancun as being something akin to a family reunion aboard the Titanic. I'm just wondering if
I'll repeat in a second. That's all right. I'll repeat it. Just finish it.
I'm curious if you're any more optimistic this year about the impending international talks, and if as a forum that's what the attention.
Good question. So there's these new UN talks coming up in Durban in a few weeks, and am I any more optimistic that they'll do anything more than the ones in Cancun? And he actually quoted a friend of mine, the great Canadian environmentalist Elizabeth May. We saw each other at one of these UN things, which are absurd and oversized and never get anywhere. And she said, "Wow, it's so much fun. It's just like a family reunion aboard the Titanic," she said. And which is sort of the feeling it always has, this same crew of people appearing. No, I don't think it's going to get anywhere at Durban. I don't think it's going to get anywhere until we really face down the fossil fuel industry in a bunch of places. That's what, we'll be there just trying to organize, and it's very useful for that. And, my crew of young people will meet all the other young people from around the world, and that's how we network and figure out how to do things. But as far as anything really happening, no. The one thing that should happen more than anything else is we should at least work out the relatively easy piece of this, which is finding the money to do north to south technology transfer and stuff. And the estimate that Hillary Clinton at Copenhagen pledged that there would be a $100 billion a year fund set up by 2020, which is actually a lot less money than it sounds like in this context. But in any event, no one's coming forward to provide the money. Not even the Europeans, who usually lead this kind of stuff. They're having their financial crisis, so they're not helping out. We're clearly, at the moment, not helping out. So it's, there are things we could do to fill it that would be pretty easy, We talk about things like this Tobin tax, 1/10 of a cent tax on financial transactions, big international financial transactions that would raise a huge amount of money and might actually stop people from doing some of the highly volatile currency trading that gets us in other kinds of trouble. Or you could do a serious tax on airline fuel or bunker fuel for ships or things like that. But so far, no one's been willing to do any of this, and the U.S., as usual, has been the kind of chief obstacle to really getting it done. So I wouldn't expect much anytime soon, and I think that the idea that the leadership on this is going to come from the top is, I'm afraid, wrong. That's sort of the thing I was saying at the very beginning. It's just like our Congress. You would think that rationally that's how it would happen. Everybody would get together. That's how the movie should end. But it'll happen the day that we make it happen, okay? And it won't happen until then. And that's I wish it weren't so, because frankly, the thought of spending the next 15 years of my life wandering around trying to, it's not really one I relish. I have a lot of other things I'd like to be doing and writing about, and, I was telling Kathy earlier today, I had a note from my wife a few weeks ago saying, you do know that you've been spent more nights in jail in the last 4 months than you have at home, right? Which is not the kind of note you really want to get from your wife, really. At least she was still there writing it, that was good. That's what it's going to take, is people really willing to dig in and get involved. And if we can figure out how to put enough heat on these guys, then that's when things change. But expecting it to happen without that is perfectly valid. That's how it should work, but it's not how it's going to work.
We have to bring the question and answer period to a close, but I wanted to correct two small errors, and one of them is that despite the best approximations of Bill and myself, we miscounted the crowd between this room and the overflow room down the hall. 725 of you were here this evening, so give yourselves a hand. Secondly, I wanted to recognize really the catalyst behind this evening, someone who worked with us closely over the past few months to be in touch with Bill and his representatives to bring him here for this evening, and that's Chris Marshall from the Department of Zoology. Thank you, Chris. And then lastly, to wrap things up, I wanted to turn the program back over to Dr. Spinrad.
Thank you. I'll be very brief. Bill, before you go down the stairs, I cannot imagine a more insightful or stimulating talk to inaugurate this Discovery Lecture Series. Yes. Thank you. We have a small gift for you. It's a collection of books by several of the OSU faculty on the life of William O. Douglas, on the Oregon wine industry, a wonderful volume by Professor Kathleen Dean Moore, Moral Ground, a collection of essays on the global imperative that is climate change, and finally an OPB, Oregon Public Broadcasting, video on the life of one of our favorite sons, Linus Pauling. Bill, thank you so much for your passion and your intellect.